December of 1860. The Pease River in northwest Texas. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight, and the grass along the riverbank was stiff with frost. A column of Texas Rangers under Captain Lawrence Sullivan Ross was moving through the low hills north of the river in near silence, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound on the hard ground. They had been tracking a Comanche camp for 3 days. A scout had spotted the lodge poles the previous afternoon, thin lines against the winter sky, and Ross had ordered his men to hold position until dawn. He wanted the light behind them when they attacked. He wanted the sun in the eyes of anyone who tried to run. The camp sat in a shallow depression near a bend in the river. 15 lodges, maybe 60 people. The scout had reported that most of the warriors were gone, away on a hunting expedition to the west, following a buffalo herd that had been spotted moving across the caprock. What remained in the camp was what always remained when the warriors left: women, children, a handful of elderly men too old to ride. The people who processed the hides, dried the meat, maintained the lodges, tended the horse herd, kept the community alive while its fighters were away. This was the camp at its most vulnerable. This was precisely why Ross had chosen this morning to attack. At first light, he gave the order. The Rangers came over the ridge at full gallop, firing as they rode. The first shots hit the lodges before anyone inside was fully awake. A woman emerged from the nearest teepee carrying a bundle and was knocked sideways by a rifle ball before she could take 3 steps. Children scattered into the grass. Horses screamed and pulled at their tethers. The Rangers rode through the camp in a line, shooting at movement, at shapes, at anything that was not a ranger. The distinction between warrior and woman, between fighter and child, between threat and helpless, dissolved in the first 30 seconds and was not re-established for the next 20 minutes. In the chaos, a woman broke from the far edge of the camp and ran north through the tall brown grass along the river. She was carrying an infant pressed against her chest with one arm, running with the uneven, desperate stride of someone who knows that speed is the only thing between her child and death. A mounted ranger spotted her and closed the distance easily, his horse covering in seconds what took her minutes on foot. He drew alongside her. She stopped running. She turned to face him. And then she did something that made the ranger pull back on his reins, so hard his horse nearly sat. She held the child up toward him and screamed a single word. Not in Comanche, in English. The word was American. She screamed it again. American, American. Her skin beneath the layers of sun damage and wind burn, and years of living on the open plains, was lighter than the other women in the camp. Her eyes, when the ranger looked closely enough to see them through the dust and the chaos and the smoke drifting from the burning lodges behind her, were blue. Her name was Cynthia Ann Parker. She had not used that name in 24 years. She had been taken from her family's settlement at Fort Parker in May of 1836, when she was 9 years old. She had grown up Comanche. She had learned their language, their customs, their way of seeing the world. She had married a war chief named Peta Nocona. She had borne him 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. She had built a life inside the nation that had taken her, and by every account that survives, she had loved that life completely. Now the men who were burning her home, and killing her people, and scattering her family's horses across the frozen prairie, were calling themselves her rescuers. But before I tell you what happened to Cynthia Ann Parker after this morning, before I reveal what the Rangers did with the other women they captured in this raid, and in dozens of raids like it across 3 decades of frontier warfare, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Texas built a fighting force whose methods against Comanche women and children were documented in their own reports, preserved in their own letters, and then systematically excluded from every history book the state produced for the next 100 years. Because what the Texas Rangers did on the frontier was not hidden by time, it was hidden by choice. You have heard of the Texas Rangers. Everyone has. They are one of the most mythologized institutions in American history. Television shows built around their name ran for decades. Novels cast them as the ultimate frontier heroes, men of iron will and unshakable moral code riding into the wilderness to protect civilization from savagery. The image is carved into the identity of Texas itself, a state that named its baseball team after them, that maintains a museum in Waco dedicated to celebrating their legacy, that teaches schoolchildren to revere them as the men who made Texas possible. That image is not entirely false. The Texas Rangers were effective. They were brave. They fought in conditions that would have broken less determined men, across terrains so vast and hostile that survival alone was an achievement. They adapted to the frontier with an ingenuity that professional military forces struggled to match. They learned to ride like Comanche. They learned to track like Comanche. They learned to fight like Comanche. And that was precisely the problem. Because when you train men to fight like their enemy, you must also decide which of their enemy's methods you will adopt and which you will reject. Texas made that decision. And the decision was to adopt all of them. The Texas Rangers were not a police force. They were not a branch of the military subject to the regulations and oversight that governed the United States Army. They were a paramilitary organization created by the Republic of Texas, and later maintained by the state with a mandate that evolved over time, but that always centered on a single objective: the removal of indigenous people from territory that Texas intended to claim for settlement. Their methods were governed not by military law or civilian statute, but by the directives of whichever governor or frontier commander held authority at the time. And those directives, as documented in correspondence preserved in the Texas State Archives, ranged from vague instructions to punish hostile Indians, to explicit orders that used the word exterminate without qualification or apology. What the Rangers did to Comanche warriors in combat was brutal, but fell within the norms of frontier warfare, as both sides understood them. What they did to Comanche women and children found in camps after raids was something different. It was documented in their own after-action reports, in letters Rangers wrote to their wives and families, in diaries kept during campaigns, and in testimony recorded from Comanche survivors decades later. These documents were not destroyed. They were not lost in fires or floods or the chaos of war. They were archived, filed, preserved in libraries and government offices where any researcher with the inclination could find them and read them. But for over a century, no Texas history textbook cited them. No school curriculum referenced them. No museum exhibit displayed them. The documents existed in the same state that housed a mythology built on their absence. The truth and the legend occupied the same filing cabinets and never touched. If you want to understand what those documents contain, what actually happened when Texas Rangers rode into Comanche camps, and what was done to the women and children they found there, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because what I am about to reveal comes directly from the Rangers' own words, their own reports, their own letters home. This is not accusation from the outside. This is confession from within. And the reason it was kept out of the textbooks is the same reason it needs to be told now. Because silence is how a society gives itself permission to forget what it has done. To understand why Texas built the Rangers, and why their methods escalated to the point where their own reports became unpublishable in school textbooks, you need to understand what they were fighting. The Comanche were not simply another indigenous nation defending territory. They were an empire, the most powerful military force on the southern plains for over 150 years, controlling a territory so vast that the Spanish, the French, the Mexicans, and the Americans all failed to dislodge them across 3 centuries of trying. The Comancheria stretched from the Arkansas River in present-day Kansas south, through Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, west into New Mexico, and deep into central Texas. At its peak, It covered over 250,000 square miles of grassland, river valley, and high desert. The Comanche controlled this territory not through fortifications or settlements, but through movement. They were horse people. Their entire civilization was built around the animal that the Spanish had inadvertently introduced to the plains in the 16th century. By the 1700s, the Comanche had become the most skilled mounted fighters in North America. They could ride at full gallop, hang off the side of a horse using only a heel hooked over the animal's spine, and fire arrows with lethal accuracy while presenting almost no target to an enemy. A single Comanche warrior could loose 20 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a musket once. European military observers who witnessed Comanche horsemanship compared them to the Mongols. It was not flattery. It was assessment. Their economy was built on two foundations: the buffalo, which provided food, clothing, shelter, tools, and trade goods,